Well, if you were listening for President Trump to mention Russia's invasion of Ukraine, well, you were disappointed. During his reelection campaign, however, Trump vowed to strike a peace deal to end the Ukraine war on his first day back in the White House. Remember that? But that ambitious promise, it has since been scaled back somewhat, with Trump now speaking about bringing peace to Ukraine within 6 months.
Before I even arrive at the Oval Office, I will have the disastrous war between Russia and Ukraine settled. It will be settled quickly. I will get the problem solved, and I will get it solved in rapid order, and it will take me no longer than 1 day. President Putin wants to meet. He's said that even publicly. And we have to get that war over with. That's a war that would have never happened if I were president, and it's a war that I'm going to try really to stop as quickly as I can.
All right, to talk more about Trump's shifting timeline for peace in Ukraine, I'm joined now by Rizzo. She's with the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. Her research focuses on European security, NATO, and the transatlantic relationship. Rachel, it's good to see you. Again, good to have you back on the program. We were struck that President Trump, in his inaugural speech today, did not mention Ukraine, not even once. What's your reaction?
Well, he didn't mention Ukraine by name, but he did excoriate the Biden administration for paying money to guard other countries' borders where the United States can't even guard its own. And I didn't hear Ukraine in that sentence, but I wonder, was he talking about Ukraine there? Was he talking about the Europeans? You know, Trump said over and over again on the campaign trail that he'd end the war in 24 hours. His special envoy for Ukraine, retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, has now said, I think in real recognition of the complexity of this situation, that they instead want to bring about a lasting peace, a lasting ceasefire within the first 100 days. So I think right now, even though Trump and his team will clearly, based on that speech, be mostly focused on domestic issues right out of the gate, I think they all see this war as a distraction, as a potential political liability, and they want to figure out a way to stop the fighting as possible.
Yeah, we've gone from the promise of ending the war in 1 day to now something that maybe can happen in 6 months. I mean, what are President Trump's options here? I mean, what do you expect that he will do?
So I think there's a couple of things. I mean, I think there's a recognition, and even if this is just behind closed doors, that this war can't go on forever. This is a recognition on behalf of the Ukrainians. I think they shouldn't expect the same level of support from the United States from Trump that they had during the Biden administration. You know, they're war weary. They don't have the weapons or ammunition or even soldiers at this point to really gain back meaningful swaths of territory. So Ukraine's in a pretty tough position at the moment. But also, you need two to tango, and Russia has not shown any interest in coming to the negotiating table. And this is where it gets really interesting, because in a study paper that Keith Kellogg drafted last year, he argues for basically forcing Putin to the negotiating table by significantly ramping up weapons deliveries for Ukraine. So let's see if that's something that happens in the first few weeks of his presidency.
You know, Ukraine's President Zelensky said just recently that he was thrilled that Donald Trump is U.S. president again. He said that Trump has what it takes to bring everyone to the negotiating table, to bring about a peace. I'm wondering, could the Ukrainians be forced to accept a deal that they are not happy with because Trump wants to get this off of his plate?
I think so. And I think the term a just peace or a lasting peace means different things to different people. And I certainly think that Trump and his team apply these definitions quite liberally. You know, 3 years after this full-scale invasion has started, I think the time has come, and the Ukrainians know this, to really figure out how to come to the table and put an end to the fighting. Now, of course, as I mentioned before, we need Russia to do that. Putin has shown no desire to come to the table, so let's see what happens there. But I think the unfortunate thing is that it doesn't seem like NATO membership is really on the table, which means that long-term security guarantees for Ukraine are going to be the real sticking point here, where Europe becomes very important.
And there's there is, of course, the intransigent Russian President Vladimir Putin. No one has been able to get any concessions out of him so far. Can Donald Trump realistically expect to be the exception?
I mean, I think possibly some people like to apply this madman theory to Donald Trump, where he makes crazy propositions and no one knows what he's going to say or what he's going to do. And that makes people, maybe more willing to come to the table. People over the last few days have been talking about Israel and Hamas as an example of this, just given the fact that he was going to come into office a few days after the ceasefire in Israel. So I think there's an opportunity that Trump could take to put maximum pressure on Putin, whether that's through increasing support for Ukraine or even through things like expanding sanctions on Russia to hit more of their banks, to hit third-party entities that support Russia's war. So certainly this is an area to watch closely, and I could see Trump maybe going pretty hard on this front. But again, we don't really know what to expect right out of the gate.
Trump is also demanding that European nations, particularly those in NATO, invest even more in their militaries. I mean, we're no longer talking about 2% of GDP. It's more like 5% of GDP. What does his return to the White House, what does it mean for this military alliance? Obviously the war in Ukraine notwithstanding.
Yeah, it's hard to know what Trump's long-term vision for European security is, but his first term is pretty easily referenceable. And it was a tough go for NATO. So I always tell Europeans, look, buckle up. The kid gloves are off, and it's going to be a tough 4 years. That underlying contract at the heart of NATO, not just the mutual defense agreement, but that the U.S. is in the driving seat here, the real driving force behind NATO's power. I don't really think that's how Trump sees it. He sees NATO allies as rich nations, free riding off of U.S. security guarantees. So Europeans need to be ready to step up, spend more, and take their security into their own hands, I think.
And the president today said he wants to be known as a peacemaker. No new wars, bring an end to the wars that are currently being fought. Is that something that Europe needs to tap into, in Brussels, Berlin, Paris? Do they need to speak to that, Donald Trump?
Well, I think this is where it gets really difficult, because you can say many things like this on the campaign trail, and then you take the oath of office and you are faced with the reality. And the reality is that there are multiple geopolitical challenges happening at once. The Middle East is a hotspot at the moment, as we've all seen. This war in Ukraine shows no signs of abating. Trump and his team want to focus on the Indo-Pacific, both militarily and economically, to counter China. And so he has to balance all of these things happening at one time. And so, again, I think I would say to the Europeans, Trump is going to expect more from them. He's going to expect more from the defense industrial base of Europe, going to expect more from NATO, and going to expect the Europeans to step up and probably take Ukraine's security into their own hands.
Rachel Rizzo from the Atlantic Council's Europe Center. As always, Rachel, we appreciate your time and your insights tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much.